Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Bordered by the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, India is the second most populous country and the biggest democracy in the world. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund recognize India as the sixth largest economy on the planet. India's dynamic foreign policy and the willingness of countries to forge a close partnership with New Delhi as an upcoming global power pose a serious challenge to a world order in which the US, Russia, China and the EU are competing for dominance. India's huge energy demands also mean that oil and gas producers have a difficult job vying with each other and satisfying the needs of the third biggest energy consuming country in the world. India maintains neutrality in international affairs but tries to play an active role on the global stage through diversifying its economic partners, engaging in UN peacekeeping missions and keeping an eye on a possible permanent seat in the UN Security Council. On this edition of India's World, we will look back at India's foreign policy in 2018 and what to expect in 2019. Joining me on the program today are KP Nair, Strategic Analyst, Sriram Chaulia, Dean, General School of International Affairs, and Shashank, former Foreign Secretary. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador Shashank, let me begin the program with you. How would you look back at India's year when it comes to foreign policy in 2018? I think before we speak broadly, let's focus first on the neighborhood and then widen our scope.
Well, in the neighborhood, there have been changes of governments, number one. Secondly, China has made deep inroads into most of the neighborhood economies. And third, I would say that most of these countries have tried to find a comfort level by talking not only to China, but to the Arab countries, then to USA, Russia also. So this first time we are seeing that Russia and China are coming together to help out some of these countries in the region, whether it's Iran, Afghanistan or Pakistan. So these are the new changes which have happened. I mean, there is no doubt at all that India has been trying to have neighborhood linkages, which we had seen that when Prime Minister Modi took over power, immediately he had invited the prime ministers and other heads of government from the neighboring states and from the countries with Indian PIO populations. So we had expected that India would get a much larger role to play in the neighborhood. But I must say that the Chinese have moved very adroitly and have taken the lead by this BRI initiative, which they are willing to put billions of dollars. And therefore, what India has to do to find partnerships with other countries who can join hands with India to put money there, and India can provide the technical expertise and say that, all right, as a democracy, we respect the wishes of the ordinary people and the political parties in those countries. We don't want to bamboozle them. We don't want to force them to follow our line of thinking.
Absolutely. And Mr. Nair, where does India's neighborhood policy stand as 2018 comes to an end?
Well, I think compared to, the present government started on a very good note. 2014 approaching the neighborhood, everybody came for Prime Minister Modi's swearing in. Then we went through a bit of turbulence, I mean, Pakistan, Maldives, Nepal. There was considerable amount of turbulence in our neighborhood. We had to come to terms with it. But 2018, the current year, which draws to a close now, things have become even now. I mean, we are on an even keel now. We have managed to establish very good relations with all the neighboring countries except Pakistan, even countries where there have been change in governments. But I want to concentrate a little bit on the domestic dimension of foreign policy in 2018. After all, foreign policy is the articulation of Indian aspirations abroad. So the domestic dimension is very important. You see, compared to the three previous years, I think 2018 will be remembered as the year when consensus returned to foreign policy. Domestic consensus returned to foreign policy. in 2018. You see, our politics is very polarized. There is no meeting ground on anything between the opposition and the government. But on foreign policy this year, there has been very little criticism by the opposition of the Narendra Modi government's foreign policy, you see. Previous years, there was criticism on how Pakistan was handled. On China, there was criticism. It was alleged that Russia has been neglected. Even on the US, there was criticism by the opposition. But that has been muted in 2018, and it is very good that domestic consensus on foreign policy has returned, because it tells our enemies that whatever may be our domestic polarization, we are united on foreign policy in protecting our interests.
It gives out this image that, everyone is putting India first.
Yes, and it gives, while it warns our enemies, it gives friends confidence that India is united on foreign policy.
Absolutely. Very well put there by Mr. K.P. Nair. Professor Sriram Chaulia, like Mr. K.P. Nair pointed out in the beginning itself, there are several sticking points really as far as some neighbors were concerned, be it, Pakistan, be it China in the beginning of the year after what happened in Doklam in 2017. We had the Wuhan summit as well, and there were several other aspects that took place really in 2018. How did we address some of these major problems?
I think, Frank, this year, 2018, we did a big strategic readjustment. The initial years of the Modi administration, we were quite clear about China posing a strategic challenge and a competition, and we did look up to the United States to a great extent to be able to assist us in creating a more balanced Indo-Pacific region. But I think what has happened is we have done a bit of a reality check with Donald Trump this year, and we have moved away from dependence on the US, as unlike in the previous years, realizing that one, Trump doesn't have any kind of long-term strategic vision, and two, he is not necessarily interested in propping up India as a counterweight to China. So in that kind of environment, we continued with the US in many ways. We had 2+2 dialogue, very important milestone for the first time this year. We also had on the sidelines of G20 the JAI, as Prime Minister Modi called it, Japan, America, India trilateral. But on the other hand, we have been hedging also. Then Wuhan summit you mentioned is very important. I think it was like the landmark diplomatic event of 2018 when our Prime Minister and the Chinese President did an informal walk around and sit down and powwow, and it was very important to rebuild the confidence after the Doklam incident of 2017. So, and we have continuously done this, behind the scenes. The mechanisms are working. There have been no fresh, incidents across the line of actual control. So, great power relations, and likewise, even with Russia, we have made sure that you mentioned that Ms. Nair was saying there's a fear that Russia was being neglected, but this year, the summit, we were very clear, we are going to buy the S-400 anti-missile system, no matter what the Trump administration's pressure is. So in a way, we asserted ourselves and readjusted to the Trump factor in a big way.
Right.
And I think we have shown, this is not non-alignment. I think that era is over, but what we are saying is that, we want India to become a great power in its own right, and for that, it needs to show this flexibility and continuous adaptation to the global environment. And that, I think, we have done quite successfully this year. And even with the neighbors, I think Maldives, we were worried about the continuation of a dictatorship there, but we got a result in our favor. Sri Lanka, there was a fear of Mahinda Rajapaksa making a comeback and whether we'll adjust, but ultimately that threat has receded, at least for now. And likewise, in Bangladesh, we expect, continuity. So all these things mean that overall, we are in a relatively secure position with no major threats to our global interests and to our regional interests. And I will give credit to Narendra Modi, because what he did was to show that he is not pro-American. There was all this allegation from the left within the country that somehow he's pro-Western or he's putting all his eggs in the basket. This year he has shown the flexibility and the adaptation to be able to readjust away. If the United States is imposing trade and tariff tariffs on us and imposing trade war on us, we are up for it. We will challenge it. If the United States is not interested in helping us rise, we will look for alternatives and diversify. I think that's the big message we have sent today.
Okay, let's broaden our scope now a little bit away from the neighborhood and look at Asia on the whole. Ambassador, a lot has happened on the Japan front, and is that something that we'll be looking forward to in 2019 as well?
Well, we had already discussed a little bit about this, that India is trying to find friends who can work with India in the neighborhood and in our relationships with other countries. So there has been talk about the Asia-Africa growth corridor. The other is the Indo-Pacific maritime security cooperation. And there again, we are talking to the Japanese as well as also holding trilateral meetings, including the United States. So that is one. Second is that Iran has been a strategic partner along with Afghanistan on the questions of making Afghanistan stable. So we have been able to get a special reprieve from the Americans, though it is only a tentative for 6 months. But we should be able to purchase our oil from the Iranian side, while in the hope that future perhaps the Americans and the others will come to some agreement on the keeping the this agreement on JCPOA on Iran's nuclear work. Chinese and Russians have been helping us in the sense that we are all together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We had the trilateral meet in Buenos Aires, the Russians, Chinese and India also, along with JAI. So therefore, India has tried to keep a flexible approach that we want India's interests to be kept in mind. And Mr. Nair is quite right that our friends and other adversaries, they all know that next year there are elections in India, and therefore Indian government will do only those things which will be in the interest of the Indian people as a whole. And so the consensus which has been built around the Indian foreign policy at the domestic level is also helping the country to have flexibility of approach by our distant and other neighbors.
Right. You know, Mr. Nair, talking about not the immediate neighborhood, but in the region, of course, in Asia, let's not forget the year started with the visit of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to India. Now, a first in nearly 15 years, really, as far as head of state of Israel is concerned. How would you look back at that?
Well, our relations with Israel has always been good. I mean, ever since we opened diplomatic relations in the 90s, it has been good. But there was always some hesitation to make public what we are doing with Israel, publicize it. That hesitation ended. But since you mentioned Israel, I want to point out something else that happened in 2018, which is very, very significant. You see, we made an reopening to Syria. You see, after the so-called Arab Spring broke out and President Assad was under pressure, we cut down our mission. There was a representation, but still we pruned the mission. Indian companies left and all that. But M.J. Akbar, who was External Affairs Minister of State, he visited Syria, which was very perceptive, you see, because now almost 9 months later, 9 months after M.J. Akbar's visit, the Americans are following us, I mean, Trump's decision to pull out of Syria is a recognition that Assad is there to stay. So we were actually, M.J. Akbar was ahead of everybody else in opening the door to Syria again. But he also visited Jordan and Lebanon. Lebanon again was neglected for a very long time. So that was one thing in the region. The other thing is, unfortunately, this hasn't got much publicity. I mean, quite amazingly, we quadrupled the aid to Palestinians. You see, in the Indian media, it doesn't get much publicity because Palestine is not very sexy in terms of news. But the Modi government increased the aid to United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees by 4 times, you know. So we have made inroads into the region. It is not just Israel, into the entire region.
Yeah, and we've played the balancing act quite well.
Indeed, yes.
Right. Professor Chawlia,